Hi, I'm Aura, but Jaden is pretty close to, and I'm the host of Collective Mind, and today we're going to be talking about different types of triggers. So, the dictionary definition, I guess, of the word trigger is pretty broad. It's just kind of like the cause part of cause and effect. Something triggers something to happen, which is why there's a lot of types of triggers, even within the specific types of context that you would expect, like a system context or generally a mental health context. And the types of triggers that I think are the most widely understood and probably the first thing that people think of when someone uses trigger in a mental health context is trauma triggers. So these are anything that reminds someone pretty viscerally of trauma memories, no matter what type of trauma it is or how silly the trigger might seem. Anything that reminds you like that of those trauma memories or causes flashback, anything like that would be a trauma trigger. And trauma triggers are a category of negative triggers, and there are some very common ones. A lot of these you'll see in trigger warnings on public places, social media, and fan fiction and that kind of thing, which are generally things that are very commonly associated with major trauma categories. So one really common example is yelling or generally loud noises is a really common trauma trigger. But it's also a very common sensory trigger, which is kind of in the next category of not trauma but still negative mental health related. So sensory issues, or something might trigger eating disorder symptoms, or generally other mental health stuff, or even physical health stuff. There are things that trigger our POTS symptoms to get worse, which is a physical disability, or things that trigger intrusive thoughts, for instance, which we would still put in the category of negative triggers, but it's not specifically trauma related. Phobias is another thing that I would put in here. Something is I guess that's kind of complicated because it kind of already has its own word, but it could be thought of as a trigger and it functions in a pretty similar way. Triggers can also be associated with age sliding or age regression. These can be positive or negative, and it doesn't have to be specifically trauma related to trigger sliding or regression, so that can kind of be its own category in a way. In a system context, trigger very often, but not always, is referring to something that would cause a switch, or encourage a switch at least, that would get the attention of or force a specific alter to front, which in the case of negative triggers is often trauma triggers, but not always. We have alters who are triggered by intrusive thought or OCD related triggers that aren't specifically trauma related. Also, again, with littles, not necessarily in the context of sliding in this case, but things can negatively trigger littles without necessarily being trauma related. Triggers in a system context can also trigger one specific alter or several alters, or even the system as a whole. One example of something triggering the system as a whole is if amnesia generally in the system increases in response to something. So that's an example of something that happens with our system sometimes. If certain types of triggers happen, our communication will suddenly go drastically down, even among alters who normally have really good communication with each other. There are also positive triggers, which in a system context would still usually be pulling someone to the front, but could also just cause certain types of positive emotions, just really viscerally. So the way I kind of think of it is the way that I feel if one of my positive triggers happens while I'm already fronting is kind of how non-switching related positive triggers work, if that makes sense. It just kind of triggers a different mindset and emotional state. Positive triggers can be associated with positive memories, similar to trauma triggers being associated with trauma memories, but it could also just be positive emotions. It could just be something that the feel of that song, for whatever reason, just makes you happy every time, as an example. The next category I have is unintentional triggers. So these are like environmental triggers that happen outside of your control or unexpectedly, so you didn't like do anything to stop it in time because you didn't know it was going to happen. And any type of trigger can be unintentional. Using the like loud noises example, if I'm just sitting peacefully in my apartment and then someone in my neighborhood randomly starts lighting fireworks unexpectedly, that would be an unintentional trigger. I didn't knowingly go to a place where fireworks were going to be, and I didn't know they were going to happen, so I didn't put headphones on or anything to dull it, that kind of thing. But there can also be intentional triggers, and this can be someone else intentionally triggering you or you intentionally triggering yourself. And in the case of someone else intentionally triggering you, consent is a huge, huge piece of that. And it has to be, because any type of trigger is vulnerable. And it's controlling to do that without consent. Intentional triggers generally can be useful. There are a lot of cases where we're having trouble switching, but the alter currently fronting is not a good fit for the situation for whatever reason, or doesn't want to be fronting for whatever reason. They're having a flashback and they're really scared of something that's currently happening, and that thing is continuously triggering them and making their flashback worse, etc. Obviously, positive triggers are ideal, generally, but at least in our case, positive triggers are often not as strong, and in some cases not nearly as strong as negative triggers. And negative triggers generally, again, at least in our case, are more reliable, especially when competing with other negative triggers. So like in the example of, let's say alter A is already triggered and fronting, and alter B, like they're trying to trigger alter B to front instead using positive triggers. The positive triggers for alter B would have to be stronger than the negative triggers for alter A, which in a system context, a lot of negative triggers develop for safety reasons. So there's a lot of like brain power, I guess, like automatic brain power backing that up, because safety, like crisis trauma mindset is the only thing brains care about when that's what they think is happening. Something that I don't really see talked about much in like system conversations is intentionally using negative triggers. And this is something that we do. And there are some pretty specific and some a little bit more general reasons that we do that. But a lot of negative triggers, at least in some contexts, are functional. There's a purpose to them. Just like trauma responses generally, like those are it's not always helpful. Like, trauma responses can be deeply ingrained while being entirely unhelpful or even making the situation worse. But in a lot of cases, trauma responses develop a specific way to keep you safer. And if, for instance, you realize that you need to be in a specific trauma mindset and you are not already triggered in that way, triggering yourself in that way in order to have that trauma response could be helpful. Some protectors in our system also have like milder negative triggers, which don't cause full flashbacks. They either cause emotional flashbacks or they cause like a specific trauma response, essentially, that can be helpful. Like, one really common example is milder negative triggers triggering a specific protector to front and mask. And that's, like, the masking part is the trauma response. And that can be really helpful in some situations to make sure that whoever switches is instantly masking. Jaden, who is one of our protectors, also, generally speaking, has a lot of triggers that will bring them to the front, put them in a trauma mindset, give them some trauma responses, like the masking one, like I just said. But they won't have the associated flashback until later, until, like, the situation is over, basically. And in situations where we need to, like, function through triggers, that's like why Jaden developed that way. That's been part of their job since before they fused into the person they are now. Michael used to have that job, essentially, of being the one to just continue to function and mask no matter what was going on emotionally for anyone else in the system, no matter what triggers were going on, to push through that and then deal with whatever feelings essentially later. So there are situations still where that's helpful or needed. There are also situations that can come up, like with persecutors, that are safety-related situations where it's really important to get the persecutor who's currently fronting to not be the one fronting anymore and to get a protector fronting instead. And there can also be situations that are similar to that, but like preventative, where a persecutor is trying to switch to do something harmful. That's like a safety concern. And a protector could be fronting and deliberately negatively trigger themselves to keep themselves fronting. That's one of the ways that protectors in our system will hold the front if they need to. To give like a fairly specific type of example of like a non-crisis situation that we would intentionally use negative triggers. Let's say a trauma holder from our system is triggered and can't switch, and the way that they're triggered is making them unable to handle, like, say we're on our way to the doctor's office. or we're in the doctor's office already, like in the waiting room or something, and a trauma holder is triggered and can't switch, and the way that they're triggered is making them, like, maybe it's making them nonverbal, maybe it's making them not know where they are, or like they would have certain types of trauma responses that would not function well for a doctor's office. That's the kind of situation where we would very likely use a mild to moderate negative trigger for Jaden, so that Jaden could front and mask and get us through the doctor's appointment, and then whoever needs to have breakdowns afterward can have those breakdowns in the car. I will say that our system used to use negative triggers too often, and we can still fall into that sometimes. There were complicated emotional reasons that we used to overuse negative triggers. And it's something that we've been working on, but it's also something that it needs to be an option on the table for us. And I'm not saying that it needs to be an option on the table for everyone, but it does need to be for us. So generally, for any type of trigger that pulls an alter specifically, there can be different types of characteristics of that trigger that I also don't hear talked about super often. Like, the one that I hear the most, I think, is how strong it is. Like, people will say, this is a really strong trigger for me, or something like that. Which, one of the ways that I think about that in a little bit more detail is, will it force that alter to front, or just like get their attention, or somewhere in the middle? That type of thing. But there's also things like, how specific is it? How many alters will be pulled by this trigger? And it can be different levels for different alters. So like, something could be a really strong trigger for Jaden, and like a mild or moderate trigger for Jade, and a really mild trigger for, I don't know, Shadow or somebody in our system. But that would still be like helpful information to know that like something is also even a little bit triggering Jade or Shadow or whoever when we're trying to pull Jaden, if that makes sense. There's also how fast of a trigger it is. Something can be a really strong trigger but not be very fast. Or it can be a really immediate trigger, but not a super strong one, so it won't compete well against a different trigger, but if there aren't other triggers happening, it would be really fast. So like, there are song triggers for us that the alter being pulled might switch halfway through the song, and there are other ones where the first note of the song instantly is going to pull them out. Under most circumstances, at least. Which brings me to, how reliable is the trigger? Are there situations where it's more or less reliable? Which is also like, is it conditional? Does it work if a different alter is already triggered? Does it depend which alter is already triggered? Does it depend which type of trigger that alter is having? There are a lot of cases like that in our system where Jade can hold the front very well unless Alistair is triggered in a very specific way, and then Jade can't hold the front against him at all. And vice versa, if Alistair is triggered in that specific way, and then Jade gets triggered in a different, very specific way, then Jade will suddenly be fronting no matter how hard Alistair tries to fight it, etc. So there can be situations like that where there are really specific examples of ways that triggers won't function as they normally do under those exact conditions, if that makes sense. Another example of that is, even if it's normally a reliable trigger, could some alters hold the front or force themselves to keep fronting while resisting that trigger for somebody else? So like there are a lot of situations like that of something might be a really reliable trigger for Jaden, but if Jade is already fronting and fighting the switch and doesn't want Jaden to switch with her, maybe then it won't work. That type of thing. Sorry about my voice. It's also helpful to know what type of trigger it is, in the sense of like what exactly is being triggered. Is it a trauma response? Is it a flashback? Is it both? If it's a flashback, what kind of flashback? Because a trigger that triggers an emotional flashback is very different than a trigger that triggers a full flashback. So knowing the difference can be really helpful. But it can also depend on a lot of factors. There are things that are normally not triggering at all that have suddenly been really strong triggers under a really, really specific set of circumstances that we never could have predicted lining up exactly like that. Or something might be a mild or moderate trigger most of the time, but then during the anniversary of that trauma, it's really strong. That kind of thing. So yeah. Triggers are kind of complicated, definitely more than just positive or negative. And I think that can be helpful to know, whether you're a system or a singlet, if you are like involved in triggers in any way, I guess. Like if you are a person who gets triggered, or you know one or more persons who get triggered, basically. If it's part of your life in any way, I think these can be helpful things to know. Or at least to think about. And screen time. So I hope you liked this video and that it was helpful in some way. If you did like it, I hope you'll click the like button to tell us that you liked it and to tell YouTube that you liked it. And then YouTube will show it to more people who might also like it. And you can also subscribe and turn notifications on to make sure you don't miss future videos. And comment your thoughts or questions or reactions or whatever else in the comments. But you can also come over to our Discord server, which is linked in the description, along with our Patreon and our Etsy shop and all that fun stuff. And yeah. Thanks for watching. Bye!